In 1969, when Elizabeth and I purchased one wing of High Chimneys, we were told that the house was built as a hunting lodge by the Barker family. Some bricks on the east side of the entrance were scratched with the date 1661. But do the bricks bear the date of the actual building? Doubt is cast when looking at the Berkshire edition of Pevsner's Buildings of England. He wrote, "High Chimneys is dated amazingly late as 1661. And when I showed the house to the architectural historian, Sir Alec Clifton Taylor, he agreed with Pevsner and said that the style of the house was older than the date suggests." Few substantial houses were being built at that time. The country had gone through a long period of austerity, being ravaged by civil war. The King, Charles I, had been executed, and 11 years of Cromwellian rule had just ended. Perhaps High Chimneys was planned, or even begun before the Civil War, and not finally completed until 1661, when the coronation of Charles II was held. 16th century Hurst was in the bounds of Windsor Forest, and local oak trees would have been felled for use in the house. Oak has always been shaped when freshly cut and still green. If allowed to stand, the timber hardens and becomes difficult to saw and work. Consequently, knowing when the trees were felled should provide a clue as to when the house was built. Examining tree rings and comparing those of the sapwood against a well-established database would provide a felling date for the timbers. In January 2012, we called on the help of Dr. Moyer, a dendrologist. He took samples from the cellar, the staircase and the roof timbers, taking 11 core samples in all. A few weeks later, his report arrived. From the samples, Dr. Moyer gave a date of between the spring of 1660 and the winter of 1660-1661 as the years when the trees were felled. This suggests that the dated bricks do provide the year of the building. But which Barker could have built the house? The senior representative of the family in Hurst at that time was John Barker, a grandson of John Barker who had served Elizabeth I as gentleman usher for 34 years. John Barker Sr. had built Hurst Lodge, and his grandson could have been living there when High Chimneys was being built. He could even have been responsible for its construction. He made his will in 1656 and lived until September 1661. His will is difficult to read, but it is clear that he left his dwelling house in Hurst, which must have been Hurst Lodge, for his wife's use until her death. She was buried in Hurst Church in 1677. John's brother Henry died 2 months later. The Barkers' interest in Hurst then passed to John's second brother, William, who was remembered in the village for building the almshouses. They were completed in 1664, only 3 years after High Chimneys was built. William was baptised at Hurst and subsequently described as of New Prison Walk in Clerkenwell, though he continued to have interests in Hurst and may have owned a residence in the village, perhaps building High Chimneys for that purpose. It seems that neither of his brothers had left any children, and William inherited the Barkers' property in Hurst. He was married, but also died without an heir. His property then passed to his sister, Frances, and then, by her marriage, to Henry Fairfax, to the Fairfax family. There is no mention of a house that can be identified as High Chimneys in any of their wills, and no evidence has been found that any of these Barkers built the house. However, there were other Barkers living or holding property in the area. An assessment dated 1607 for rents due to the King for his royal manor of Sonning lists several brothers. High on the list is the rich landowner Anthony Barker, Esquire. Further down are John Barker, Edward Barker, William Barker, and Thomas Barker. All were the children of William Barker of Middle Temple in London. These Barkers of Sonning are relevant, as Winnersh, the township where High Chimneys was built, though in Hurst parish, was in the manor of Sonning. Another contender as a building is Henry, the son of John Barker, Esquire of Sandhurst. He was buried at Hurst in 1678, and, looking further afield, there were the Barkers of Grove House in Chiswick, represented in the 1660s by Henry Barker, who held land at Binfield, Arborfield and Barkham, together with the parsonage and rectory of Wokingham. Research proves that all these families were related, being descendants of William Barker of Wokingham. Rather than trace down the family line looking for clues, it might be better to jump forward several generations to find a known owner of High Chimneys. Using the tithe map of Hurst parish dated 1840, which lists landowners and tenants, we discover that High Chimneys, plot 1078, was occupied by Charles Scarborough and owned by Elizabeth Rose Barker. The Winnersh enclosure, assessed 3 years later, gives the owner as the heirs and devisees of the Reverend Francis Henry Barker. This is clear proof that the house was once owned by the Barker family. A search of the clergy database provided details about the Reverend Barker. He was the son of Edward Barker of St Andrews in Holborn in London, and aged 17 in 1774. Knowing his age led to the discovery of his baptism at St Anne's Church in Soho, in the parish of Westminster. He was the son of Edward and Anne Barker. Francis Henry attended Wadham College in Oxford and became vicar of St Stephen's near St Albans. This turned out to be the church where his grandparents were buried. In 1793 he was appointed rector of Northchurch in Hertfordshire. While at Northchurch, the Reverend Barker erected a plaque to the memory of 2 children, Henry Thomas and Maria. Both died while young. The coat of arms above the monument provides clear proof that the Reverend Francis Henry was indeed related to the Barkers of Hurst, Sonning and Chiswick. The shield with the lion and spears bears the same symbols as can be found on the Barker memorials in Hurst and Sonning churches. The Reverend Barker died at Northchurch in 1830. In his will he left all his messuages, cottages, closes, farms, lands, grounds, hereditaments and pastures whatsoever, situated in Hurst in the county of Berkshire and elsewhere, which must have included High Chimneys farm with nearly 180 acres, to his wife Elizabeth, his daughter Anne-Marie, and her husband, the Reverend William Bruton Roth of Edlesborough in Buckinghamshire. Subsequent electoral rolls for Winnersh show that the Reverend Roth was receiving an annuity rent of £100 charged on a farm called High Chimneys. This is equivalent to about £8,000 in today's money. It seems reasonable to assume that High Chimneys passed to the Reverend Barker through his family line, and tracing his ancestors might provide some answers. His father, of St Andrews, was baptised at Holborn in 1729. Few details are known about his life, but in a deed concerning his sister's separation, he is described as of Dean Street in Soho, and he and his wife Mary had at least 2 children baptised at St Anne's Church, which stands to the southern end of Dean Street. Details of his marriage and profession are unknown, but in 1770, when his daughter Elizabeth was married, he was described as St Julian's, the part of St Albans where his mother family lived. He died before 1798, when his wife was described as a widow living in Mayfair. In the 1798 Forestry Commission assessment for the liberty of Winnersh for land tax purposes, High Chimneys must have been included. The only Barker on the list is a Miss Barker. This might refer to an unmarried aunt, or to the Reverend Barker's widowed mother Anne, if wrongly described by the commissioners as a spinster. When she made her will at Mayfair that year, she did mention her son, but not any property in Hurst. But this would have not been required if transfer of the property had already been settled on him. About 70 years earlier, the manor of Hurst had changed hands when purchased by John Dolby Esquire. He subsequently produced a map of his new estate, and though High Chimneys was outside the manor, it was close enough to the boundary to be included and called Mr Barker's house. Providing the house passed down the family, the best candidate for this Mr Barker is Edward Barker, Reverend Francis Henry's grandfather. He was born in 1685, and his first marriage took place at St Luke's in Chelsea, where he married Mary, the daughter of Richard Gough. Their daughter Anne was baptised at St Andrew's Church in Holborn in 1724. 2 years later, Edward remarried in the fashionable church of St George's in Hanover Square in London. His new wife, Mary, was the daughter of Henry Killigrew of St Julian's in Hertfordshire. Mary subsequently inherited much of her father's estate, which passed into the Barker family. Edward and Mary Barker leased a house in Greville Street, close to Hatton Street, now Hatton Row, at the centre of London's diamond industry. One document indicated that the house backed onto the rear of the popular Furnival's Inn in Holborn. Furnival's Inn was eventually demolished to make way for the Prudential Insurance Building. Edward became a citizen of London and in 1921 a merchant salter. At least 4 of his children were baptised at St Andrews. He must have prospered, for when Anne, his daughter by his first wife, married John Ayton of Furnival's Inn, he is said to have given her a great fortune, despite the marriage being contrary to his repeated prohibitions. Edward's second wife, Mary, made her will in 1732, and in March 2 years later was buried at St Stephen's Church with 2 of her children. He continued to live in Holborn until his death, but was not buried there. The vicar of St Andrew's Church simply wrote in the registry that he went away. His will explained that his wishes were to be buried in the vault near his wife at St Stephen's, but it does not mention any property in Hurst. Fortunately, the Salters Company archivist discovered that Edward's father was also called Edward, who we shall call Edward Senior. He traded as a draper, but the Drapers' Company of London were unable to identify him amongst their records. However, they suggested that he might have joined one of the other textile livery companies when the influence of the drapers declined in the 17th century. A search of the merchant tailor's records provided a likely candidate for Edward Senior. He married Anne, the daughter of Admiral John Penniman at St Mary-le-Bow in London. Further searches at Kew produce his will, then described as a citizen of London and merchant tailor. It mentioned his father, Henry, and 2 children, Edward and Elizabeth. One of the witnesses was Scorry Barker. Scorry is such an unusual Christian name that it must link him to the Barkers of Chiswick. Edward was no doubt the brother of Scorry of Grove House in Chiswick. But was he the father of Edward the merchant salter? The known facts of Edward the merchant salter are that he mentions only one sibling in his will, a sister called Elizabeth. This suggests that he and his sister Elizabeth could be the children named in Edward Senior's will. The Salters Company established that his father was called Edward, and that he traded as a draper, but he could have joined another company, as suggested by the archivist. Though the evidence is not conclusive, it does suggest that Edward Senior was the father of Edward the Salter and great-great-grandfather of the Reverend Francis Henry Barker. Although there is no mention of Hurst in Edward Senior's will, his brother Scorry did leave property in the parish of Hurst, which could have been High Chimneys, along with other Berkshire property, to his son Henry. But whether it was Scorry or his brother Edward who owned High Chimneys points to the same person as the builder of the house, their father, Henry Barker of Grove House in Chiswick. Henry Barker was baptised at Chiswick in 1609 and subsequently fought for the king at the Battle of Lansdowne, and later served as clerk as Crown in Chancery. He held land at Barkham, Arborfield, Binfield, and the rectory and parsonage of Wokingham. He lived till well into his 80s and died in 1695, 34 years after High Chimneys was built. The evidence so far points to Henry Barker as the best candidate for the builder. He was alive when the house was built and living in Chiswick. He may have wished to have a hunting lodge in the country. He was a direct ancestor of the Reverend Francis Henry, the documented owner of the house, and the father of Scorry, who had held property in Hurst. The Hurst Barkers appear to be ruled out as the family left no children, and the family line ended shortly after the house was built. Also, their property is said to have passed to the Fairfax family. The Wokingham line are also ruled out, as there is no direct line to the known ancestor of the house. Unfortunately, no deeds which would have been created when the property was transferred between owners has survived or been discovered. Perhaps they are in private hands or locked away in some solicitor's safe. Without further evidence to disprove it, Henry Barker of Chiswick is the best candidate to have built High Chimneys. It might even have been that he built it on the land previously owned by his father, Thomas, who paid tax to the king in 1607 for his freehold in the manner of sonning.